So some time ago, I went on Dr. Ford Brewer's YouTube channel, and among a number of other things, we ended up talking about carbohydrate in the diet and diabetes and insulin resistance. And it was a very interesting discussion because Dr. Brewer and Dr. Jesus, who works with him, they had a bit of a different background and a bit of a different view on things, but they were very open to talking about it. I've been on his channel twice now, and both times it's been like this. They're very open to conversations and to hearing contrary views. So here's that part of our conversation and the whole recording for people who are interested. I'll link below. Check it out. Enjoy.
And what about, this is a point where Dr. Brewer and I have probably a little bit of a different perspective, and maybe not, because we're all about, if you have insulin resistance problems, pre-diabetes or diabetes, you don't know it, look for it, make sure that you don't have it. And if you do, be careful about the type of carbohydrates that you eat on a daily basis. So can you give us your 2 cents on what's your perspective on the role of carbohydrates on a healthy diet? And if somebody was to decide, okay, I'm seeing a bunch of diets out there. I'm seeing that there is carnivore, that there's plant-based, that there's Mediterranean, that there is low carb, that there's keto diet, there's paleo, and all these other trends. What's the best diet that works for me if I'm worried about carbohydrates?
So first of all, the way you phrased it, be careful about the type of carbohydrates that you eat, I think is phenomenal advice for anyone. And that's in a nutshell how I look at carbohydrate. Be mindful of the type of carbohydrate that you eat. I don't avoid carbohydrate in my diet. I don't avoid fat in my diet, but I do pay close attention to the type of carbohydrates and the type of fats. So to me, it's less about the quantity of these macronutrients and it's more about the quality. And I think most viewers know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about refined carbohydrates, Pop-Tarts or soda or whatever, all these ultra-processed, highly refined carbohydrates, not great choices. And then whole carbohydrates, like fruit or like whole grains or like legumes, for most people, and let's say people who are metabolically, their glucose metabolism works fine. I don't avoid those foods in my diet. Now, do I think that there's a room for personalization? For example, somebody has type 2 diabetes. Can it be a reasonable strategy to moderate high glycemic carbohydrates or high glycemic foods and replace with other things? Yeah, I think that makes sense. It could be part of a sensible strategy. I don't think that we need to tell everyone to be scared of carbs. I don't think carbophobia or lipophobia help, but understanding the difference between types of carbs and then how it can be personalized for individual circumstances, I think that's very important and reasonable.
That sounds like a point for Dr. Brewer and his "it depends" answer to everything. Right?
I knew Jesus was going to try to draw me back into that.
Well, I don't know what you're doing back there.
I'm just listening.
Oh, man. Okay, do you have an opinion on that, Dr. Brewer? The role of diet, the role of carbohydrates for a long, healthy life?
I do. You know, some of it's personal, Gil. As I've aged, when I was in my early 60s, I first found out that I was significantly insulin resistant. And I also first found some plaque in my arteries. And because it was getting so personal, I studied a lot more at that point in time. And then began to find out that most of us have significant insulin resistance. And I agree. If it's not, I agree with part of I think what I'm hearing from you, and that is, if it's not a problem for you, then it's probably not a problem. And I would also agree clearly, no matter what we're talking about, that there's a major difference in carbs. You've got very glycemic carbs, as you mentioned, like Pop-Tarts and sugar sweetened drinks. Then you've got, and cereals and high ultra processed grain products. And then you've got other carbs like, sweet potato always gets listed as a healthy carb. And then you've got a very inert group of carbs in terms of your blood sugar, the fibers, cauliflower, broccoli, etc. But I think the biggest challenge is that there's a lot more insulin resistance out there than any of us have recognized in the past.
I agree with that, especially if we're talking about US or kind of Western hemisphere in general, that it's a problem. Just to touch on that briefly, I'm going to try not to be too long, but with respect to insulin resistance, the evidence that I've seen is that carbohydrate, in terms of preventing insulin resistance, let's start there. That carbohydrate doesn't have much of an impact. You can there's all kinds of studies looking at low carb versus low fat diets, and as long as you maintain healthy body weight, and even starting with people with insulin resistance, I've seen trials with all kinds of diet breakdowns, higher carb, higher fat, lower carb. And as long as you have weight loss, you consistently see improvements in insulin resistance. So based on the data that I've seen, I'm not worried about carbohydrate for me, particularly, and for people who don't have that issue. In terms of somebody who already has, for example, type 2 diabetes, you can put diabetes in remission on all of these diets as well. And we have trials showing all that. You can take someone who's diabetic, give them a low carb diet, put diabetes in remission, and give them a high carb diet, put diabetes in remission, as long as the critical factor seems to be losing enough adipose mass. There are some nuances, but we're talking about general broad strokes. So that, I think, is important. And then there's a more nuanced argument to be made about, okay, if you're giving someone with type 2 diabetes a very glycemic diet, are you causing harm in that interim before they achieve remission, because you're causing these excessive glycemic spikes? There's an argument there. I think it's an interesting debate. But in general, I think with any of these diets, as long as they're mostly whole foods, and depends on personal preference as well. I have viewers, for example, who went on a low-fat, very high-carb diet. They put their diabetes in remission, and they stayed there for years. And I have many viewers who are the exact opposite, went on low-carb diets and achieved similar metabolic results. And both of these people are doing really, really well. And often the same person says, well, I tried the other diet and it was a complete flop for me. So there's an element there of personal preference and what people are able to maintain and sustain long-term. And I think that's crucial. But I don't see a universal concern with all carbs for causing diabetes or causing insulin resistance.
So, Dr. JV, we seem to have gotten from blue zones into low carb. I still have, I actually am biting my tongue because I have a reaction I'd like to make, but I'm waiting for you.
Well, just don't forget it, because you tend to use that. You tend to just say, I'm going to say something, and then you forget. But I think we agree, because you both said glycemic carbs, and that's the key. It's not just any carbs. And we are all saying just be aware of, avoid the processed foods and refined carbs, which is probably the worst thing you can put in your body. It's the tastiest, it's the most flavored, and that's the purpose, to keep you addicted to all that stuff, all that junk food. But whenever somebody says junk food, we think about hot dogs, hamburgers, sausages, and the process of those can be tricky as well. But we're also talking about the cakes and the cookies and the processed cereals. That's the whole point. And I think we're basically saying the same thing. One thing that I agree on the blue zones part is they're saying most of these people are trying to eat a low-calorie food that is very nutrient dense. And if you are into the standard American diet, you're doing exactly the opposite. You're having a lot of calories with very, very few nutrients. And that's the whole point. Regardless of the macronutrients, if those are full on nutrients, they're nutrient dense, not so much calories, and they're not spiking your blood sugar over time. They're not keeping your blood sugar about 120, 140 on a daily basis continuously. Then you're safe. If you're trying to get some good results by eating the Pop-Tarts every day and having that for breakfast, that's not going to work. And that's part of the blue zones lessons as well. Even if we don't agree with the science behind the blue zones entirely, there are some good lessons. Like, you want to live longer, your job is to do a healthy lifestyle every single day. And that's the hardest part.